History has a way of hiding in plain sight, tucked between the margins of forgotten news cycles and the dry entries of municipal ledgers. In the autumn of 1958, a curious event took place across the sprawling industrial landscape of the American Midwest, specifically in the Twin Cities of the Tri-County area, a hub of post-war manufacturing and burgeoning suburban life. On a Tuesday morning in October, without fanfare or advertising, 8,000 black umbrellas were distributed to the morning commuters and residents. They weren't sold. They were handed out by young men in nondescript grey suits at train stations, bus stops, and street corners. To the citizens of 1958, a year defined by the quiet conformity of the Eisenhower era and the looming shadow of the Cold War, it seemed like a generous, if slightly eccentric, marketing gesture. But there was no brand name on the canopy, no logo on the handle, and no card tucked into the ribbing. People simply took them, opened them against a light morning mist, and went about their day. Records suggest that within 3 hours, the visual profile of the city had been completely transformed into a sea of uniform black silk. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand the atmosphere of 1958 is to understand a world balanced on a knife's edge. This was the year of the International Geophysical Year, a global effort to map the Earth and the heavens. But it was also the year of the organization man, where social cohesion was prized above all else. In the Tri-County area, the local economy was anchored by aerospace subcontractors and chemical plants, places where hush-hush was a way of life. When the umbrellas appeared, the local press barely gave it a column inch. The Gazette mentioned it as a surprising act of urban courtesy, speculating that a local department store was preparing for a grand reopening. However, surviving city council minutes from that week show no record of a permit for a mass distribution of goods. In an era of strict municipal oversight, 8,000 objects were moved into the public sphere with zero administrative footprint. And then the weather turned. The mist that had greeted the morning commuters didn't develop into a storm. Instead, the sky remained a flat, bruised grey, and a peculiar atmospheric phenomenon began to settle over the valley. Witnesses, interviewed decades later for local historical societies, recalled a heaviness in the air, a static charge that made the hair on their arms stand up. Those carrying the black umbrellas reported a subtle, rhythmic vibration humming through the wooden handles. Most dismissed it as the rumble of distant machinery or the vibration of the nearby limestone quarries. But some historians believe that the umbrellas weren't distributed to protect the citizens from the rain. Records suggest they were part of a coordinated, low-frequency acoustic experiment, though the entity behind it remains unidentified. The umbrellas, it seemed, were acting as localized antennas, and that's when things began to shift. By noon, the distribution was complete, and the grey-suited men had vanished as quietly as they had arrived. No one saw a truck, no one saw a warehouse. It was as if the umbrellas had simply materialized in the hands of the public. At 12:15 p.m., the local civil defense sirens units typically reserved for air raid drills began a low-level oscillation. It wasn't the rising and falling wail of a drill. It was a constant, singular tone that sat just at the edge of human hearing. In the streets, the 8,000 people carrying the black umbrellas didn't panic. In fact, archival photographs from that hour show a disturbing level of synchronization. In one famous, grainy image captured by a hobbyist photographer from a fourth-story window, hundreds of people can be seen crossing the main intersection, all with their umbrellas deployed, moving with a mechanical, lockstep precision. They weren't looking at each other. They were looking straight ahead. There is no clear consensus on what triggered this collective behavior. Some sociologists point to the ash conformity experiments of the same decade, suggesting that the umbrellas acted as a visual cue for mass social imitation. If everyone else is holding an umbrella and walking with purpose, the individual feels compelled to do the same. But that doesn't explain the technical anomalies. A local radio technician, writing in an amateur electronics journal in 1959, claimed that his equipment had picked up a massive surge in white noise during those specific hours, a signal that seemed to be reflecting off the very fabric of the umbrellas. He described the canopies as parabolic reflectors that were focusing a signal from the sky onto the people beneath them. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. As the afternoon progressed, the umbrella event moved from a curious social anomaly into something far more clinical. At the local memorial hospital, records from the emergency room show a sudden influx of patients between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. These weren't victims of an accident or an outbreak. They were individuals who had been carrying the umbrellas and had suddenly entered a state of profound sensory detachment. They were awake, their eyes were open, but they were unresponsive to verbal commands. The attending physician, a doctor, Aris Thorne, noted in his personal log that the patients all exhibited a peculiar physiological trait. Their pupils were fixed and dilated, and their skin temperature had dropped by several degrees, despite the mild autumn weather. Most curiously, none of them would let go of their umbrellas. Even in the sterile environment of the hospital ward, they gripped the handles with a strength that defied their physical stature. The military presence arrived shortly after dusk. This wasn't a full-scale occupation, but a technical recovery team from the nearby Wright-Patterson area, traveling in unmarked olive-drab vehicles. According to a retired sergeant who spoke on the condition of anonymity in the late 90s, the mission was not to treat the people, but to retrieve the hardware. The umbrellas were collected one by one. In some cases, they were traded for standard, store-bought replacements. In others, they were simply taken from the hands of the unresponsive citizens. By midnight, the streets were empty, the sirens had stopped, and the 8,000 umbrellas were gone. The following morning, the sun rose on a city that seemed to have developed a collective amnesia. There were no front-page stories, no lawsuits, no public outcry. It was as if a mute button had been pressed on the memory of the town. But that wasn't the strangest part. When modern researchers began digging into the provenance of the 1,958 distribution, they looked for the manufacturer. Umbrellas of that era were typically made by a handful of large domestic firms or imported from specialized European artisans. But the umbrellas from the Tri-County event had no manufacturer's mark. Laboratory analysis of a single surviving fragment, a small strip of black silk recovered from a storm drain in 1961, revealed that the material wasn't silk at all. It was a complex polymer interwoven with microscopic threads of a silver-palladium alloy. In 1958, such a material would have been at the absolute bleeding edge of materials science, likely costing more to produce than a small car. Why would 8,000 pieces of high-tech hardware be given away for free to a random population? What were they measuring? Some historians believe the answer lies in the International Geophysical Year, IGY. While the public face of the IGY was about satellites and Antarctic exploration, the classified side involved atmospheric coupling, the study of how human populations could be affected by changes in the ionosphere. There is a theory, never stated as certainty, that the Tri-County area was being used as a testbed for a primitive form of passive radar. If a signal were bounced off the ionosphere, the 8,000 umbrellas could have served as a massive, distributed synthetic aperture to map the movement of people and vehicles with terrifying precision. But this doesn't explain the dilated pupils, the unresponsiveness, or the sensory detachment. It suggests that the experiment wasn't just about mapping the environment, it was about mapping the mind. The paper trail for the 8,000 Black Umbrellas project, if it ever existed in an official capacity, has been effectively scrubbed from the National Archives. However, a series of shipping manifests from a defunct logistics company in Baltimore shows a delivery of weather monitoring equipment to the Tri-County area in September 1958, weighing approximately 12 tons, roughly the weight of 8,000 heavy-duty umbrellas. The recipient was a shell company with an address that led back to a vacant lot. As investigators pushed further, they realized that the event wasn't an isolated occurrence. Similar reports of mass giftings of mundane objects, hats in 1956, watches in 1960 had occurred in other industrial towns, always followed by the same eerie silence. And that's when a new piece of evidence surfaced in the private letters of a former government psychologist. The letters of Dr. Milton Vance, discovered in a damp basement in 1988, provide the first crack in the official silence surrounding the autumn of 1958. Vance was a behavioral psychologist who had consulted for various defense contractors during the early years of the Cold War. His correspondence with a colleague in Zurich mentions a program he called Project Canopy. In these letters, Vance doesn't speak of umbrellas as fashion accessories or weather protection. He describes them as tactile interfaces for low-frequency entrainment. Records suggest that Vance was obsessed with the idea that the human nervous system could be tuned like a radio if the right conductive medium was placed in close proximity to the body. The black umbrellas, with their silver palladium alloy ribs and specialized silk, were that medium, but the letters revealed a target that wasn't just the mind, it was the collective rhythm of the city itself. To see the human cost of Project Canopy, one must look at the private diary of Dorothy Gable, a housewife from the suburb of Green Meadows. Her entry for the 14th of October 1958 begins with a mundane observation about the free gift her husband, Arthur, brought home from the train station. She noted that Arthur seemed unusually settled that evening. He didn't complain about the commute or the rising cost of groceries. Instead, he sat in his armchair, the black umbrella still gripped in his right hand, staring at the blank screen of their television set for 4 hours. Dorothy wrote that when she tried to take the umbrella to put it in the stand, Arthur's grip tightened until his knuckles turned white. He didn't speak. He simply vibrated. It was a micro-scale version of what was happening across 8,000 households, and that's when things began to shift. The stationery event occurred 3 days after the distribution. It is a moment rarely mentioned in local history books, yet it remains etched in the memories of those who were children at the time. At the Friday night high school football game, the social heartbeat of the Tri-County area, nearly 2,000 people arrived carrying the black umbrellas despite a clear, starlit sky. Archival film footage, recovered from a local news station's discard bin, shows the stadium lights reflecting off a sea of black silk. At halftime, as the marching band took the field, the music suddenly stopped. The entire crowd, as if guided by an invisible conductor, stood up and opened their umbrellas in unison. There was no rain, there was no wind, there was only a heavy, humming silence that lasted for exactly 6 minutes. The players on the field reported feeling a static prickling on their skin, and the stadium's electronic scoreboard began to cycle through random numbers. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In the aftermath of the stadium incident, a local physics teacher named Harold Miller began a private investigation. Miller had noticed that the umbrellas seemed to be reacting to the town's civil defense sirens. He theorized that the sirens weren't just emitting sound, but were acting as transmitters for a high-gain, sub-audible frequency. Using a homemade galvanometer, Miller tracked the signal strength across the valley. He found that the signal was strongest not near the sirens, but in the center of the crowds carrying the umbrellas. The umbrellas weren't just receiving the signal, they were amplifying it and rebroadcasting it back into the people holding them. Miller's notes, now preserved by his estate, suggest that the 8,000 citizens were being turned into a living, breathing neural network. But before he could take his findings to the local authorities, his laboratory was destroyed in what was officially ruled an electrical fire. The escalation of the military's technical recovery started the following Monday. The unmarked olive-drab trucks returned, but this time the men in grey suits were replaced by soldiers in fatigues with no insignia. They went door to door, citing a product recall due to a chemical defect in the umbrella's waterproof coating. Some historians believe that the government was surprised by the intensity of the stationery event and moved to terminate the project before it became a national news story. However, the recovery wasn't as clean as the distribution. Many residents refused to hand over the umbrellas. They had developed a physical, almost narcotic dependence on the vibration the handles provided. In the working-class neighborhoods near the chemical plants, reports of scuffles and mysterious disappearances began to surface in the police blotters, and that's when the narrative took its darkest turn. A classified memo from the Office of Naval Research, dated November 1958, mentions a loss of 74 biological units during the final phase of a project codenamed Dusk Fine. While the memo doesn't explicitly mention the Tri-County area, the numbers correlate with a sudden spike in missing persons reports from that region during the same week. These individuals were mostly commuters, men and women who had been the primary carriers of the umbrellas. Records suggest that they didn't just lose their umbrellas. They lost their ability to function in the untuned world. Some were found wandering the limestone quarries, their hands still curved as if holding a handle that was no longer there. The military's response was to implement a regional health quarantine, effectively cutting off the Tri-County area from the rest of the state for 14 days. During this quarantine, the physical evidence of the 8,000 umbrellas was thoroughly erased. The local landfill was seized and used as a central disposal site for the reclaimed hardware. Witnesses reported seeing columns of black smoke rising from the pits for 3 days straight, a smoke that smelled of ozone and burning plastic. But even as the umbrellas were destroyed, the effects lingered. The sensory detachment noted by Dr. Thorne didn't disappear. It evolved. The townspeople became notoriously quiet, their social clubs and civic organizations slowly dissolving into a culture of isolation. The Tri-County area, once a vibrant hub of manufacturing, became a sleepy valley, where no one asked questions and no one looked too closely at the past. But that wasn't the strangest part. In 1964, during a routine excavation for a new highway bypass, workers uncovered a cache of nearly 500 black umbrellas buried in a concrete vault beneath an old bus depot. These weren't charred remains, they were perfectly preserved. The workers who found them reported that the air inside the vault felt vibrant, and within hours, several of them began to exhibit the same dilated pupils and lockstep walking patterns seen in 1958. The site was immediately cordoned off by federal authorities, and the vault was refilled with liquid lead. This suggests that the umbrellas weren't just passive tools, but had become charged with whatever frequency they had been designed to harvest. The question shifted from who distributed them to what they had become. Modern re-examination of the umbrella event has been bolstered by the declassification of documents related to the CIA's MK-Ultra program. While no direct link has been proven, the timing and the psychological profiles of the Tri-County victims align perfectly with the agency's interest in mass behavioral entrainment. Some researchers believe that the black umbrellas were a prototype for a system intended to maintain civil order during a nuclear exchange, a way to keep a population calm and compliant while the world burned around them. Yet, the material science involved the silver-palladium alloy points towards something even more complex. It suggests a level of sophistication that was, quite frankly, out of place in 1958. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. A retired aerospace engineer, who had worked for a local subcontractor in the 50s, came forward in 2005 with a final piece of the puzzle. He claimed that his company had been tasked with creating miniaturized low-frequency resonators that were meant to be hidden in the handles of common consumer goods. The goal, he said, wasn't just behavior modification, it was human-to-human data transfer. The 8,000 umbrellas were a test for a wireless communication system that used the human body as the signal carrier. If this is true, the people of the Tri-County area weren't just subjects, they were the first human hardware in the history of the digital age. But as the engineer attempted to provide blueprints, he suffered a stroke that left him unable to communicate. The record went cold once again. The silence that settled over the Tri-County area after the 1958 quarantine was more than just a lack of noise. It was a structural change in the community's character. For the next 2 decades, local sociologists and census takers noted a statistical anomaly that became known in academic circles as the Tri-County Stare. The region reported the lowest rates of domestic disturbance and petty crime in the state, yet it also saw a near-total collapse of local politics and volunteerism. It was as if the 8,000 citizens had been permanently smoothed out, their individual eccentricities erased by the 4-hour hum of the black umbrellas. Records suggest that by the 1970s, the town's primary industry shifted from active manufacturing to long-term storage and data processing, a quiet, stationary business that mirrored the temperament of its people. But that wasn't the strangest part. In 1978, exactly 20 years after the distribution, a retired librarian named Martha Finch began a private project to map the health outcomes of the original umbrella carriers. She found a recurring pattern that the official health department reports had overlooked. A significant number of the carriers, those who had held the umbrellas for the full 4 hours, had developed a rare form of calcification in the pineal gland. This small, pea-sized part of the brain is responsible for regulating sleep patterns and, according to some neuroscientists, plays a role in spatial orientation. Finch's research, which was never formally published but exists in a series of spiral-bound notebooks in the local historical society, suggests that the vibration from the umbrellas had physically rewired the biological clocks of the townspeople. They weren't just compliant, they were literally out of sync with the natural day-night cycle of the rest of the world. As the 1980s brought the dawn of the digital age, the umbrella event underwent its first major technological re-examination. A group of independent researchers, utilizing early computer modeling, attempted to recreate the parabolic reflector theory proposed by the radio technician in 1959. They found that if 8,000 silver-palladium alloy surfaces were positioned in the specific street grid of the Tri-County area, they would create a standing wave of electromagnetic energy. This wave would not be dissipated by the buildings. Instead, it would be trapped in the valley, creating a localized bubble of high-frequency interference. Some historians believe that this bubble was the true objective, a way to create a silent zone where the military could test experimental communications without being detected by Soviet satellites. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 1994, a declassified IGY document surfaced, referring to a Project Ion Shield. The document described an experiment in passive atmospheric lensing using common objects as resonators. While it didn't name the Tri-County area specifically, it contained a map of ideal resonator densities that perfectly matched the population density of the town in 1958. The document suggested that the goal was to create a human-centered defensive canopy, a way to shield a city from the electromagnetic pulse, EMP, of a nuclear blast. The 8,000 black umbrellas were, in this interpretation, the world's first civilian EMP shield. The people holding them weren't just test subjects, they were the grounding wires for a city-sized circuit. But the document also contained a handwritten margin note: biofeedback loop exceeds predicted tolerances, resonance becoming self-sustaining. This self-sustaining resonance provides a chilling explanation for why the town remained so eerily quiet for decades. If the signal didn't stop when the sirens turned off, if it had been stored in the very geography of the valley, the people were living in a permanent state of low-level entrainment. Modern electromagnetic surveys of the Tri-County area, conducted by hobbyists in the early 2010s, have indeed found a background hum that is unique to that specific valley. It is a frequency that doesn't correspond to any modern cell tower or power line. It is a ghost of 1958, a lingering vibration that some believe is still being carried by the descendants of the original 8,000. Personal stories from the 21st century have added a final, emotional layer to the mystery. In 2018, a young woman named Sarah Gable, the granddaughter of Dorothy and Arthur Gable, discovered a hidden compartment in her grandfather's old mahogany desk. Inside was a single, black handle, carved from dark wood and tipped with a silver palladium ferrule. The silk canopy was gone, but the handle remained. Sarah reported that when she picked it up, she felt a warmth that seemed to spread from her palm to her shoulder, followed by a sudden, vivid memory of a rainy street she had never visited. It was a sensory replay, a fragment of her grandfather's experience from 60 years prior. This suggests that the umbrellas weren't just reflecting signals, they were recording them. There is no clear consensus on the ultimate fate of the 8,000 black umbrellas. While the military claimed to have destroyed them, the discovery of the lead-lined vault in 1964 and the Gable handle in 2018 suggests that hundreds, perhaps thousands, remain unaccounted for. They are tucked away in attics, buried in backyards, or sitting forgotten in the corner of dark basements. Each one is a silent piece of a massive, distributed machine that no one knows how to turn off. Records suggest that the government's interest in the project ended in 1959, but the physical reality of the canopy continues to exist in the margins of the Tri-County landscape. As we look back at the autumn of 1958, the distribution of the 8,000 umbrellas feels like a parable for the modern age. We live in a world of constant connectivity, where we are surrounded by invisible signals and smart objects that track our movements and influence our behavior. The black umbrellas were perhaps the first iteration of this reality, a low-tech version of the algorithms that now shape our digital lives. They were a gift that no one questioned, a tool that served a hidden purpose, and a technology that left a permanent mark on the people who used it. What happened next remains unclear, as the official archives remain sealed and the witnesses continue to fade away into the quiet history of the Midwest. Modern re-examinations of the umbrella event often end at the same wall of silence that Captain Gikas or Julian Hallowell encountered in their own mysteries. Whether it was a defensive shield, a behavioral experiment, or a fluke of Cold War science, the 8,000 black umbrellas remain a singular anomaly in the American story. They remind us that the most profound changes often come without warning, handed to us on a street corner by a man in a grey suit, while we simply open the canopy and walk into the mist. The valley remains quiet. The sirens are used only for fire drills now, and the limestone quarries have been reclaimed by nature. But if you walk the streets of the Tri-County area on a grey October morning, you might notice something peculiar. Even when there is no rain in the forecast, and the sun is threatening to break through the clouds, the older residents still carry their umbrellas. They don't open them, and they don't seem to need them for the weather. They simply grip the handles, their knuckles white, as they walk with a rhythmic, lockstep precision toward a destination only they can hear. The record of the 1958 distribution is a collection of fragments, a strip of alloyed silk, a doctor's log, a scorched stadium scoreboard. Together, they form a picture of a moment when the boundaries between the individual and the state were blurred by a simple, black object. We may never know the true origin of the 8,000 black umbrellas, but we know their effect. They turned a city into a circuit, and its people into a song. And in the silence of the Tri-County area, that song is still playing, just below the threshold of the wind.